My presentation today will focus on unequal access to COVID-19 vaccines and COVID-19 vaccination, an obviously major issue because of its health impact at global level, but also a major issue as we learn the lessons from the pandemic and try and design a new international system for pandemic preparedness and response. At this time, 11 vaccines have been listed on the granted emergency use listing of the World Health Organization. And as you may see on this slide, most of these vaccines have been developed in a record time, in less than a year, and received emergency use authorization in the respective countries where they were developed and produced in the last few months of 2020 or early 2021. In short, the vaccines we currently have are highly effective in protecting people from the risk of severe disease and death, and that has now been shown in large studies at population level. However, these vaccines have only limited capacity to prevent new infections and a very limited effect on viral transmission. So we can't expect these vaccines to stop and end the pandemic. Most recent studies in the current context of Omicron and Omicron-derived variants circulating, studies from Israel have shown that booster mRNA vaccines remain highly effective in protecting from severe disease and death. However, that the duration of efficacy in individuals of over 60 years of age, that is the most vulnerable group to severe disease, is only 4 to 5 months, which means that in those populations, repeated boosters will continue to be needed. Unequal access to vaccines came as a shocking feature of the pandemic within the first 6 months of 2021 as the vaccines became available. And that has been called vaccine nationalism. In May 2021, at the time of the first report released by the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response, high-income countries had secured, through bilateral deals with manufacturers, over 200% population coverage in vaccine doses, whereas at the same time, fewer than 1% of people have had a single dose of vaccine in the poorest countries. And that vaccine nationalism played against the availability of vaccines globally, because also manufacturing capacity, which was concentrated in only a small number of countries, became early saturated. That is not the case anymore. And also because of private sector control over intellectual property rights and industrial capabilities prevented decentralizing the manufacturing of vaccines. So at that time, the panel recommended a series of immediate actions and then a series of short, midterm and longer term activities. One of the immediate actions recommended was that high-income countries who had secured so much vaccines would commit to provide to low and middle-income countries at least 1 billion vaccine doses by September 2021 and more than 2 billion doses by mid-2022. If we look now in November 2022 at what's happened, actually 1.83 billion doses, that is 12% of the total number of vaccine doses administered globally, had transited through Kovacs, and half of that, that is 900,000 doses, let's say, or close to 1 billion, had been vaccines that had been shared by high-income countries with low and middle-income countries, a 50% achievement as compared to that original recommendation. The panel also recommended that the World Trade Organization and WHO convene vaccine-producing countries and manufacturers to agree to voluntary licensing and technology transfer for vaccines. India and South Africa called for a temporary waiver on intellectual property on COVID-19 vaccines. However, a ministerial conference in spring 2022 failed to reach agreement on these issues. In terms of longer-term recommendations from the panel, I will not read them all, but just the one here in red. We recommended that a new system is designed and that a so-called end-to-end, I'll come back to that terminology, pre-negotiated platform for vaccines and pandemic countermeasures is established to ensure equal opportunities for everyone across the world to benefit from access to these tools in case of a new outbreak, epidemic, or pandemic. But that has not really materialized so far. As we look at the picture in December 2022, unequal access to vaccines remains a dominant feature of the landscape. Almost 2 years after COVID-19 vaccines were introduced, over 85% of the population in high-income countries have been fully vaccinated, and most people have received 1, 2, sometimes 3 boosters. But only 25% of people in low and lower middle income settings have received at least 1 dose. These inequities obviously lead to prolonged outbreaks, to preventable illness and deaths, and to the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. These inequities also lead to a number of questions on the future of the pandemic. That inequitable access is best illustrated on this slide. This slide shows the number of doses received per person in high-income countries and upper middle-income countries. That's the upper curves in purple and red. In lower middle-income countries, that's the curve in green, and in low-income countries, the curve in blue. And you can see how striking the differences are and how, in fact, the situation hasn't really changed over the last year between December 2021 and December 2022, despite the public opinion being so sensitized about this. Kovacs was designed early in 2021 as a procurement mechanism for the whole world by Gavi, WHO, CEPI, UNICEF. And Kovacs originally had 3 arms. One was a pooled procurement arm for wealthier countries called the Self-Financing Participants Facility. The second arm was a humanitarian buffer to make vaccines available for people in emergency situations. And the third arm was an arm aimed at supplying vaccine to low and middle income countries. The first arm clearly failed because countries rushed to procure vaccines themselves through bilateral agreements with suppliers. And the independent evaluation of the so-called COVID Accelerator, or ACT-A, published in October this year, concluded that these first 2 arms of Kovacs didn't work. When it comes to the third arm, I leave it to you to make your own judgment. As I said earlier, by November 2022, 1.83 billion vaccine doses had been delivered through Kovacs, which is about 10% of the total number of vaccines administered globally. Now, in December the issue is not so much about how much vaccines are available. There's been enough manufacturing. Vaccines can be purchased, can reach at least airports, but the issues are downstream challenges in low and middle income countries, and particularly low income countries. Challenges with national supply chains and delivery systems, basically challenges to transform vaccines into an effective vaccination that, as a priority, would be vaccinating healthcare personnel and people at higher risk among the adult population in the country. And then, of course, in many countries across the world, and particularly in low and middle income countries, there's high and increasing vaccine hesitancy. So the picture that we face now is that almost everywhere, the surveillance is much lower than it was. There's much less viral sequencing across the globe. There's less testing, and there's a much decreased uptake of protective measures. There is an overall decrease in the number of vaccines that are being administered every day. And the Kovacs program is either about to close or at least to focus on some of the most under-immunized settings and possibly considering shifting COVID vaccines into routine vaccination programs of lower middle income countries. But at the same time, we see that COVID-19 hospitalizations are increasing again in the US and Europe, and that coincides with severe outbreaks of influenza and RSV. And we're very uncertain and actually concerned about the future of the epidemic in China. What you see on this slide is the striking decrease since January 2021 of the total number of vaccines that are administered every day worldwide. So what do we need for the future? Obviously, the current market supply-driven model is inadequate, and the current redistribution model has shown inadequacy as well. The current market system has too many built-in limitations to effectively, rapidly stop epidemic-prone outbreaks because the system prefers to invest in supplies that guarantee a return on investment, which small outbreaks can't do, nor can investing in stockpiles that may expire and need replenishment. So we need a totally new so-called end-to-end R&D system, end-to-end meaning that from the first step of research and development, the end step of equitable access will be considered. And that basically means a pre-negotiated agreement and rules to govern the collaboration between the public and private sectors. That has begun with technology transfer across all regions, but more needs to happen and faster. WHO has sponsored the development of vaccine manufacturing hubs, first in Cape Town, South Africa, now also in Argentina and Brazil, to develop and produce mRNA vaccines. Many issues are being discussed. Will we be able to build regional R&D hubs? Will we be able to build manufacturing capacity that can be rapidly scaled up? Will we be able to build clinical trial platforms that would perform independent public health endpoint trials will we be able to finance and governance a system that would ensure equitable supply. These are key issues. However, it is as yet unclear whether such new approaches to research and development for pandemic health technology will be negotiated within the frame of the new pandemic treaty that is being discussed in Geneva and of the political declaration of the forthcoming UN General Assembly in 2023. And yet, these changes are absolutely needed if we want outbreaks in the future never become an epidemic or a pandemic again.